Britain's Brexit bill has become law, overcoming the last formal hurdle before the country leaves the EU in a week's time. The House of Commons Deputy Speaker announced the Withdrawal Agreement Act had received royal assent from the Queen. Earlier, the bill completed its passage through Parliament, receiving approval from the House of Lords. The European Union's Parliament is due to vote on the Brexit divorce deal next week. Well, joining me for more on this is Bruce Wilson, Director of the European Union Centre at RMIT University. Thanks very much for your time today. So Brexit becomes law. Gee, this would have been screened from the headlines once upon a time. It's not really getting the breathless coverage anymore. We're a fait accompli, of course, essentially, since the election. Is that the reason why this is not getting much attention? Is there anything more to it?
I think it's certainly getting plenty of attention in the United Kingdom. Here, less so, perhaps because it's summer and still many people are preoccupied with the issues of the bushfires and the implications of the bushfires and what we have to deal with. But yes, in the UK, it's a very big issue. I think you're right that the passing of the legislation was taken for granted. So trivial things like whether or not Big Ben would bong on 11 p.m. on the 31st of January have taken up a bit of attention. But yes, it's happening.
It's not smooth sailing, though. I mean, this was always supposed to be the easy part, Bruce. You've got the Scottish National Party declaring a constitutional crisis, noises from Wales as well. Is that going to come to anything?
I think we're watching the beginning of the disintegration of the United Kingdom. When that might happen, I'm not sure, but I think certainly you will find ongoing pressure from Scotland for a new referendum and the prospect that that would lead to Scottish independence. And of course the circumstance of Northern Ireland is even more muddied in the light of the arrangements that are proposed in the withdrawal agreement than they were under Theresa May's version. So I think the longer term prospects for what happened to Northern Ireland mean that we're talking really about a very strong affirmation in England about their independence from the EU.
But does that potential splitting up of the UK depend on the deal that Boris Johnson gets with EU and how that actually operates? Yes, there's concern about what sort of fallout and whether there'll be chaos around goods and so on. Does that really depend on what he can land and the lived reality, I guess you'd call it?
I'm sure it does. No, I think that's a good point. And of course, the implication of what you're saying is that rather than Brexit being over, in one sense, it's actually just beginning, because next month negotiations will begin between the UK and the EU over their future relationship. How are those existing trade ties, their security ties, their education and research ties, the very simple matter of mobility across borders? How is all of that going to be handled in the future after the 31st of December 2020?
On that immigration factor, Bruce, what are the indications of how that's going to be applied? Because this was one of the big parts of the campaign, and there was criticism about it, big parts of the campaign that the people in the UK, the Brexit Party and the Brexiteers ran on, that England had lost control and the UK had lost control of its borders. What is set to change? How much control will they get back?
Well, they certainly do have the capacity now to determine the basis of migration into the UK. One of the things that the EU has made clear, however, that the extent to which the UK can expect to have access to the single market will depend on the extent to which they comply with the rules of the single market. And that, of course, includes movement of people. So insofar as the UK wants to diverge from the current arrangements, then there will be costs in terms of their access in other respects to the goods and services and capital movements in Europe as well. But Boris Johnson is talking about introducing a points-based system, not unlike Australia's immigration system. So that's the kind of direction that I expect them to move in.
Indeed. So that's the quote. He's actually mentioned specifically an Australian-style immigration system by which, well, you have total control really over your borders. You set skilled migrant visas, for example. You set caps on all the different categories of visas, and you have a sort of number you're going to hit. Is that likely to be achieved? You're saying the only blowback there will be what it costs the UK in the single market access, but they will be able to set the rules how they like?
Well, they can set the rules. I think with immigration, as we see here in Australia, there are trade-offs. So one of the big problems for the UK right now is the sudden decline in the number of workers who are coming in to do jobs that many people don't want to do. I'm talking about things like picking berries, harvesting horticultural products of other kinds. These are not the kinds of jobs that have been readily taken by UK citizens. They're the kinds of things that have been done by migrant workers coming in from Eastern Europe. Who's going to do that work now? Right. How will that fit with Johnson's points-based system, his attempt to attract skilled workers? At the other end of the scale, he has committed to 50,000 new nurses. Where is he going to get 50,000 new nurses from? Perhaps Australia, perhaps other parts of the world. But he's got to manage all of those kinds of challenges in putting the new policy together.
So on, say, those temporary agricultural workers, we know in Australia that system operates via in some ways it can be countries from anywhere, Canada, the UK, the US and so on, and they can extend their holiday visas in Australia by going off and doing, say, 3 months of fruit picking or whatever it might be. Is there going to be an issue for England? Maybe there's not the dream to go and, you know, soak up the beaches of the UK, and that sort of incentive just for a short-term visa is not the same?
Well, I'm certainly not attracted by the beaches in the UK for the most part myself, so that's a good point. Look, I think there are lots of issues around attracting workers into those kinds of jobs in Australia, quite apart from what they will encounter in the UK. One of the consequences of the noises about immigration is that for many EU workers, the UK has suddenly become a pretty unattractive place. Even those EU citizens currently in the UK, for whom noises have been made about ensuring their rights to stay as settled citizens in the UK, one of the reasons it's held up the passing of the Withdrawal Agreement Act in the last week or so has been the House of Lords' attempts to get greater clarity for the status of EU citizens in the UK, and they failed to do that. So there's quite some concern in the UK about the status of existing EU workers in the UK, and that, of course, will potentially defer other EU citizens who might want to still come to the UK from doing so.
Right, so the difficulty is just starting. I'm not sure that people in the UK want to hear that, Bruce Wilson, but we don't hide from the truth. Thanks for your time today.